The reading this morning is really all about the Catholic Church. This is something that Catholics and only Catholics do. Well, I don't know whether they do what I'm about to read here anymore, but this is from the 1950s. But first, since the reading is so short, I think I'd like to share with you how really odd certain things are about Catholicism and what Catholics do, that Catholics and maybe some of us just take absolutely for granted. For example, the sign of the cross. Now, that is known as blessing yourself. Goes this way. But there's another way to do a sign of the cross, and that's what priests do in front of congregations, and they go like this. Both of those are signs of the cross. Now, when you think about what the cross symbolizes, it symbolizes the awful death with torture of a man who lived over 2,000 years ago. Now, in those days, capital punishment was by crucifixion, so cross, crucifixion. But imagine what it would have been like if in those days they had had electrocution as the matter of, you know where I'm going with this? Then instead of this, it would be okay. This is actually eating time into the reading. The reading is very short, so I thought I'd share that with you. So I was going through my books recently, and I found a volume, and its title is Medical Ethics, and it's written by a Catholic priest of the Franciscan Order, 1958, Medical Ethics. Priest is a faculty member at Villanova University. The foreword to the book, Medical Ethics, is by Fulton J. Sheen. You may remember Bishop Sheen. He had a popular TV show in the 1950s. It was called Life is Worth Living, and it was on the Dumont television network. Remember, there were three networks, the ones that we all know and love, and then there was the Dumont off to the side, and that's the one that he was on, 1950s. Of course, most of us aren't that old that we can remember that. So I'm going.
Version to Metro Media that was acquired by Fox.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, that's interesting. Almost appropriate. So now I'm going to quote very, very quickly from Bishop Sheen's foreword to the book, Medical Ethics. Bishop Sheen says, "God made the world with a divine sense of humor. He never took anything seriously except the salvation of a soul." Now, what's baptism all about? It's about making sure that a soul gets saved, because if you're not baptized, you've got original sin on your soul and it hasn't been washed away, and you cannot be saved with original sin on your soul, inherited from some Neanderthal. Anyway. So keeping that in mind, what Bishop Sheen just wrote, I'm going to quote to you something from chapter 10, and this is literal. I am quoting literally. These are not my words from this Catholic volume on medical ethics. It's for health professionals. Any living product of human conception, regardless of its deformity, must always be baptized. When a deformed fetus clearly represents more than one person, each should be baptized absolutely. When it is doubtful whether the fetus is a single person or several persons, one should be baptized absolutely, and the others should be baptized conditionally. In the case of a fetus with two chests and one head, the head should be baptized absolutely, and each chest baptized conditionally. When death is imminent in the case of multiple monstrosities, it is permissible to baptize them simultaneously by pouring water on the head of each and pronouncing the baptismal form in the plural. I baptize you all in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. So what do we get from this? One thing, God has a sense of humor.
Carl was born and raised in Utah. At the age of 19, he went on his Mormon mission in Japan. He returned. He married Carolia, and they've been married for 42 years. He received a degree in accounting from the University of Utah. And he practiced as an accountant for a number of years until being downsized on his own birthday. So He enjoys camping, hiking. He's run 5 marathons, which probably, the endurance probably stands him in good stead because he's now a bus driver with the Vancouver School District. So please welcome Carl Anderburg. Carl?
So, I want to thank you all for inviting me here. I'm not a professional speaker. I think the way I became known about this topic is I've done it a couple of times at the Unitarian Universalist Church over in Vancouver, where I go to church. And Dell Allen, who I think is a member here, heard about that and asked if I would, just come and speak about that experience. So, as Dave said in my introduction, I was born and raised in Utah. I was born a Mormon, but in my early childhood, my family wasn't active Mormons. In fact, I can remember, many mornings, a lot of Sunday mornings, getting up and my dad sitting at the table with a beer on the table and chain smoking cigarettes. And if he wasn't an alcoholic, he certainly abused alcohol. I can remember many nights him not coming home from work. In fact, one time my mom got so mad that she called a taxi, loaded up me and my 2 sisters and my brother, and drove to the bar where he was, went to the door and said, "Don, get home right now." He came out. My mom got back in the taxi and we all went home. He came home later. So it was kind of a tumultuous childhood for the first 5 years of my life. So we were members of the Mormon Church. We didn't go, but they have this program called visiting teachers or home teachers. And so even if you're not active in the church, these home teachers would come every month and give you a lesson or a message. And I guess when I was about 5, these 2 home teachers came and talked to my dad and said, "Don, the way you're going, you're gonna lose everything. You're gonna lose your family if you don't stop your drinking." They didn't say smoking, but maybe they did. Maybe they mentioned that too. And it's amazing. He took that to heart. He listened to it, and he said, I'm gonna see how long I can go without drinking and without smoking. And he stopped that very night, and he says, I never had the desire to smoke or to drink again. So this had a profound impact on me as a child and our family in general. So from that point on, they started getting, my parents got active in the church, started obeying the word of wisdom as it's known, eschewing alcohol, tobacco, and hot drinks, hot beverages. So we started going to church. When I was 6 years old, we went to, me and my 3 siblings, went to the Mormon temple in Salt Lake where we were sealed to my parents for time and all eternity. That's another doctrine or concept of Mormonism that many of you may be aware of. Families are important, and generally when a couple gets married, they're sealed, and then any children born to them are part of that sealing, and then when you die and go into the afterlife, if you've been worthy, you're together for forever and ever. About a year after my dad stopped drinking and smoking, on November 22nd, 1963, it was the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated, our family got some other bad news. My dad had been to see a heart doctor that day and found out that he had to have open heart surgery in just a few months to replace an aorta valve that was failing. He'd had rheumatic fever as a child, and then I think the complication of 30 years of smoking had done a lot more damage to his heart. And so in January of 1964, he went in for surgery to have his aorta valve replaced. And I was scared. I was 9 years old. I went to school. My dad was in surgery all day long, and I just sat in school all day wondering, if my dad was going to be alive when I got out of school. Well, the surgery was successful, and the recovery took a long time. But one interesting connection there is the current prophet or president of the Mormon Church is Russell M. Nelson. And before he was called to be an apostle and eventually became the prophet of the Mormon Church, he was a heart surgeon. And he is the surgeon who performed the surgery on my dad. So my parents just revered him, and of course I did too, growing up, and I still have a lot of admiration and gratitude to him, because I think he was, had a lot to do with saving my dad. My dad lived another 27 years with that artificial aorta valve. It was a Star Phillips, and the year before he died, when he went to see the cardiologist, that cardiologist says, "I never saw one that lasted more than 15 years. They'd all been replaced." So that was my upbringing, and sort of my testimony. I mean, these miraculous things happening to me, and all connected to Mormonism. In fact, I had a 5-year-old friend who was a Catholic, and we were pretty good friends for quite a while. And he said, there are more Catholics in the world than there are Mormons. I said, "No way, you're lying to me." I said, "I look around here and everyone is a Mormon. You're the only Catholic that I know. That cannot be true." And I believed that for a long time. So it was very comfortable growing up in Utah as a Mormon. That's what I wanted to do. I was so happy when my parents got active in the church and we started going to church together. I never gave it much thought as to what it was like for those kids that weren't Mormon, and how outside and sort of ostracized and not fitting in, how they must have felt. I didn't give it a second thought. I was interested in how I felt and what this meant to me. And so, as Dave mentioned, I did the Mormon things. When I was 19, I went on a mission to Japan, Kobe, Osaka, that area, just a few hundred miles south of Tokyo. Came home and got married within a year, and that was kind of a crazy thing to do. I mean, I did that because that's what we were counseled to do. It's education is important. You should do that, but getting married, having children, having a family is the most important thing. Don't worry about finances. God will take care of those things. So my wife had gone on a mission too. She went to Calgary, Alberta, and when she got home, we got married, and within a year we had number one, and within another year and a half after that, we had our second son. I mean, we worked hard. I worked full time as a janitor while going to school, and my wife managed the 21 unit apartment building that we lived in until I graduated from school. We did make it. It wasn't easy like they said it was, and I would never have done that or taken that advice if I had known better. So what finally happened was there are different priesthood callings in the Mormon Church for boys. Girls have, they have their own thing. They don't get to participate in this important stuff. But when a boy turns 12, he gets the Aaronic priesthood and becomes a deacon. When he's 14, he becomes a teacher, and when he's 16, he gets ordained to be a priest. And then when you're 19 and are eligible to go on a mission, you go into what is known as the Melchizedek priesthood, the higher priesthood. And there are 3 offices in that as well: elder, 70, and high priest. And all of the Mormon missionaries that are out there, that's why they're called elder so-and-so, is because that's their office in the priesthood. They're an elder. Well, I was asked to be a 70, which not very many people are. And a 70 sort of has a special calling. They're supposed to be a missionary to the local area that they're in. I wasn't too excited about that, but when you're called to something in the Mormon Church, you don't say no. It's, it came from God, and so that's what you do. So I was a 70 for quite a while, and in my early 30s, I was living in Layton, Utah, just a suburb a little bit north of Salt Lake City, and we had a special meeting that was called. And the reason the special meeting was called was because there were, groups of fundamentalist Christians going around telling lies about Mormonism. And this meeting was to let us know what they were saying, and how we could have responses to what they were saying. So in this meeting, these 2 gentlemen that were presenting it, they handed out an 8.5 sheet of paper with statements about the Mormon Church. And we were supposed to answer whether these statements were true or false. And I wish I had saved that paper so I knew all of them, but I didn't. So I just jotted down a few of them that I could remember. And the first one was, there have been over 4,000 changes to the original translation or manuscript of the Book of Mormon, and some of them are significant. No way. That's false. Joseph Smith received that directly from God. Why would there need to be any reason for revisions or changes? Mormon temple rites are based on Scottish Masonic rituals. What? No, it can't be true. The Book of Abraham, in the Pearl of Great Price, one of Mormon standard works or scripture, is really a translation from an Egyptian papyrus that is really just a funeral text. It's not the story about Abraham traveling in Egypt. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but this papyrus that Joseph Smith acquired when he was alive, he came up with this wild translation of Abraham and his experiences in Egypt and almost being sacrificed and so forth. And then this papyrus disappeared for a long period of time and reappeared, I think, in Chicago in the 1930s or something like that. And by this time, the Rosetta Stone had been discovered so that these characters could be translated, for exactly what they were, and they were in no way what Joseph Smith purported them to be. I was aware that Joseph Smith had practiced polygamy, but one of the statements here was Joseph Smith married girls as young as 14 and married women whose husbands he had sent on missions. Oh. It can't be true. Brigham Young had a whiskey distillery, and the word of wisdom was not strictly adhered to in the early days of the church. False. No, can't be true. Several different versions of Joseph Smith's account of his first vision of meeting with God. Many of them contradictory. So there were a few more questions like this, and I was stunned. I guess not so much that these things were true, but because I was 30 years old and I hadn't heard him before, we hadn't been trusted as members of the church to deal with these truths. We had been given the sanitized version, and that all sounded so wonderful and lovely. And I mean, it was like the fear of God was put into you that you should never look outside official church sources to get any information on it, because they are false and that's Satan's way of leading you to, down to destruction and hell. So by nature, I'm a conformist, and I like structure. I'm a rule follower, and if you just follow the rules, everything will turn out okay. If you're baking a cake and you follow the instructions all the way, the cake will turn out. So I was just going to follow the rules and make my way into heaven that way. So I come home from this meeting, and I'm a bit bothered by it, and I walk into the kitchen and I say to my wife, look what I just heard. And I started reading them to her, and I thought she'd say, oh, just forget it. And she says, I've had my questions too. And so that, if she would have said something like, oh, forget it, I'm sure there are answers for it. We just have to have faith. I would have said, okay, yeah, that's great. So I guess it's kind of like, Adam and Eve, the woman, she deceived me. She's not here, or she would be upset about me just saying that, because she hates that. So that's what led to it from that very meeting right there. The first stuff that we read were publications that were put out by fundamentalist Christians that were really anxious that Mormons could find out how wrong they were, or how wrong Mormons were, and so they would quote the Bible or other things to point out how wrong Mormonism was. One book in particular that I remember reading was The Changing World of Mormonism. It's by Gerald and Sandra Tanner, who are both descendants of early Mormons. In fact, I think Sandra Tanner was a descendant or a great-great-granddaughter of Brigham Young himself. They had done a lot of research, and I liked it. Everything that they pointed out that was, what I had learned in this meeting was true, and they had official church records that pointed to writings of Brigham Young and Joseph Smith, and even the standard works of the church themselves. So that was, we just eventually read ourselves out of the church, but it wasn't easy. At this time, our oldest son was 9, and at 8 years of age, kids get baptized in the Mormon church, so he had just been baptized. Our second oldest had just been baptized too. Our daughter was looking forward to being. And we would go to church and sit in Sunday school classes, and we would ask questions, what about this? And we were told that we couldn't ask those questions in our Sunday school classes. And they said it's okay to have those doubts and those kind of questions, but don't ask them in front of everybody else because you'll shake someone's faith. My faith has been pretty shaken here, and so we met with our bishop and with members of the stake presidency, and we'd say, well, what about this? Why couldn't blacks hold the priesthood until 1978? We've read all these things. Some apostles of the Mormon Church wrote that the Negroes, would never hold the priesthood in this life, and then in 1978, all of a sudden they could. The answers that we always got were, well, sometimes prophets who speak to God, sometimes they have their own opinions and their own beliefs, and those get in the way of actual revelation or inspiration. So I'm saying, well, then how do you tell the difference? How do you know when they're speaking of things that they've actually received from God, or just the voices in their head? So I always just got back to, well, there's just so many things in this life that we don't know, and we'll know more when we die, and so just have faith in these leaders that they're leading you in the right direction. So I can just remember so many times on Sunday after church, we generally get in the car with our kids and go visit our parents or something, and my wife and I just be going back and forth with this stuff. And my second oldest, who was all with us about getting out of the church, he's back there listening intently, and he says, well, if it makes you so unhappy and so mad, why don't you just leave? He's so right. He's so right. But yeah, it still was. I mean, it wasn't easy. But the good thing is for a long time, my parents, who were still active, my wife's parents, she kind of came from a dysfunctional family, and they weren't really active in the church, so I don't think they really cared whether she was in or not. In fact, some of them had kind of bitter feelings themselves. But my parents, it was still really important to them. But we would visit them every week, and we didn't talk about it. We didn't tell them we weren't going to church. We didn't tell them we didn't believe anymore. But finally, after 2 or 3 years, I just finally had to come clean and say, this is where we're at. And my mom was just heartbroken, and she says, I know when some of my brothers and sisters left the church, they didn't want to have anything to do with us anymore. I says, you know what? It's been 3 years or so since I haven't been going to church. You didn't know until I told you. I still want to have, a good relationship with you. I just want to be honest with you and let you know where I'm at. So the way we dealt with it with the family is it was out there, and then you just don't talk about it anymore. Everything else is superficial, because people, and I wasn't really interested in changing other people's minds. I knew what I wanted for me, and I explained some of the things why I had come to this decision, some of these things that we talked about here, that there's just no way the Book of Mormon could be what it is. There's no way that that's the real history of ancient America. And they were surprised about some of these things. They said, really? Is the Mormon temple ritual based on Scottish ritual? I said, yeah. Those secret handshakes and secret names and stuff. I haven't been through a Masonic temple, but, based on what I really know. And, I mean, Joseph Smith was a Freemason, so he adopted those things into the Mormon temple rites as well. My wife and I eventually took once again, she prodded me here. I didn't see the need to do this, but as long as you don't do anything, you're still considered a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I think nowadays they claim membership of above 16 million, something like that, whereas there's probably something like 3 or 4 million that actually attend and actually believe. So unless you ask for your names to be removed from the records of the church, you're considered a member forever. So we took that action to do that. We had to contact our local bishop, write a letter, and then he talks to us about what that all means, and then he takes that letter and delivers it to the church, but you still have a whole month before that becomes official. They give you a whole month to think about this and change your mind. And so he came back after a month, and he says, "Is this still what you want to do?" And we said, "Yes, it really is. It's one thing to not believe anymore, but we felt like we needed to do this to be honest with ourselves." But one thing I felt was really interesting, and I don't know if he got direction on this or not, or if it was just his opinion, once again, him hearing the voices in his head. But he said, your temple sealing together is still valid. And I didn't say anything, but I'm thinking, okay, these are your rules. I guess you get to decide. But by this time, I was pretty soured on almost any organized religion or anything that believed in a supernatural deity. I think that was one of the things that Joseph Smith got right when he prayed to God, and God came down to him and said, don't join any of them. None of them are true. And I think it's also true of Mormonism. It's all, yeah, none of them are true. We're just all here as human beings and trying to make our way. So then it was like, what do? We were kind of ostracized from the community that we had been a part of for so long. We stopped going, and people were wondering, well, what's happened to them? And I still had contact with a lot of them. And in fact, one friend said, well, now that you've left and you don't have this religion to believe in, what keeps you with your wife, and what keeps you? Well, how can you be a moral person? And I, really? I think that's just. I'm a human being. I have feelings. I want to treat other people, the same way. And it's interesting how many people think that way, that if you don't have religion and the fear of eternal punishment hanging over your head, that you can't be a moral person. And it's so nice to be here with so many moral people that, that don't feel that way. So we just kind of, and it's like, we don't want to go out and start drinking and, hanging out in bars like that. We're not that kind of people. So, and so what do we do? And I was reading in the paper, and I saw where there was a support group at the Episcopal Church in Salt Lake City that met every Sunday night. So we started going there. And that was wonderful because, all right, there's other people that are going through this. Because until I met these people at that group, I didn't know one other person who had left the Mormon Church. So who do you talk to about that experience and what to do? So that was really nice, and that sort of became our religious service for a while. And we met another couple there that was going through the same thing. The man in that couple, his family was really prominent in the church. His dad was the stake president, which is he had leadership over, I would say, 4,000 people or something, 8 congregations, which would have been about 4,000 people. And he says, I can't tell my dad. I mean, here's this guy. He's a successful lawyer, and he's had these doubts and hasn't believed for a long time. I can't tell my dad, and I don't know if he ever did. But after a while, the wife said, "There's something that you might like, the Unitarian Church." and so we did. We went there, and we liked it. I'd never heard of a Unitarian before that. 30 years in the Mormon Church, and what the hell's a Unitarian? And we went there, and it was wonderful. The songs were hard to sing. It wasn't what I was used to. But there were no prayers to open or close the services, and the sermons were very thought-provoking. The minister was just wonderful, and so that was one of the things that this couple said. So there's really something about having paid clergy deliver the sermon versus a lay clergy. So we ended up there and just slowly, drifted away from Mormonism. I was really, really angry for a long time, and that's why I kept reading and reading. I think part of it was because I was angry, and part of it was I wanted to keep proving to myself that I was doing the right thing, that I hadn't missed any of all these wrong things that they'd been telling me. And I think one of the things that really bothered me the most about the Mormon Church, I think I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, was not so much that all these things that they just went through were real, and it was that they didn't trust us to deal with them. And I can really see why, because, if they had, and had to admit all of these things weren't true, then Mormons would be just like the Unitarians. Really good people, that didn't have this supernatural belief in God. And so, in Mormons' defense, they are really good people. But there's a lot a lot of guilt and a lot of fear that we feel. And I have to admit that that is one of the greatest feelings that I had, is that, once I knew in my mind that there wasn't the policeman in the sky, watching over me and going to judge me for everything that I did, I felt a lot better. There wasn't a reason for everything that happened that I didn't understand, and I just had to wait for God to explain it to me at some time. It was just so nice to let go of all those things. Yeah. So that's kind of my story. Do any of you have any questions? Or
Hi. I was curious if you had any advice for someone trying to help another person who's moving out of religion. It can be kind of a daunting experience to be like, oh, I spent 20 years in a religion and now everything's meaningless. What do I do with my life? So I was wondering, since you were in early adulthood when you started moving out of it, if you had any advice from a secular perspective on that.
boy, I don't know. I would say find a group like this. Find someone who is of a like mind as you. I mean, that's sometimes hard to do. When I gave this presentation at my church over in Vancouver last May, it was interesting. Someone that I had worked with 10 years ago saw that I was speaking, and she contacted me. She's almost my age, and she's been a single mom for a long time. She says, I'm looking to get out of, in her case, Mormonism. What do I do? And I think it's just, and so I just said, I'll talk to you. I'll listen to you, and because I can understand. And so if you can, I guess if you have gone through that yourself, or if you know someone who has, maybe, get them together. But I think we're just kind of all on our own path and finding our own way.
There was a group that sponsored annual meetings of ex-Mormons in Salt Lake City. I think they stopped doing it. I wonder if you've heard about that. But I happen to know the lady who was president of that organization for a while.
Yeah, I think that's Sunstone. Does that sound right? Yeah. They would have people come and present, about things that are controversial to Mormonism. And I think I actually attended a couple of those. It's not really a support group. It is, like you say, a semi-annual conference. And I think they meet maybe even the same weekends as they're having the LDS general conferences in Salt Lake City on those same weekends. So the people who are having their doubts and questions can go and get, the real scoop at those conventions.
I'm just curious about that meeting that you went to where you received the sheet of paper with the facts about more. Why in the world did they do that, to give that to you and tell you that? I mean, I find that just mind-boggling that they would confirm that they are true.
Well, there was quite an effort at that time with some fundamentalist groups that they were actually going out and putting these books on people's doors, and we got one. It was called The Bible, God's Word, Final, Infallible, and Forever. And so they were trying to get ahead of the curve. And I can't remember all of their answers, but they were apologists for all of these things, and they had answers for them. And so they were trying to give us the answers to them so that we would be armed with them and can share them with anybody else who was, had been confronted with the same information.
They never just said that's not true.
Right, yeah, they didn't say this. They didn't say this isn't true. They said, Well, for example, the one where there have been all these changes to the Book of Mormon, it was, well, a lot of these were probably just transcription errors, because when Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, he put a rock in a hat and looked into it, and then he said the words, and his scribe, Oliver Cowdery, wrote them down. And so I guess Oliver, missed a few of the words or something. But
I'm curious. Well, I've always been impressed by the Mormons and their ability to, cooperate and work together and get things done in incredibly difficult circumstances. And I was wondering, well, an example here in Portland, that we have a tremendous homeless problem. Do they have the same thing in
Salt Lake City?
Yeah, in Salt Lake City, or do they just ignore them if they're not Mormon, or what?
I don't know for sure. I know if you're Mormon and homeless or lacking in resources, there's certainly that the help is more readily available than if you aren't. I think the Mormon Church does try to get involved in solving the homeless problem overall. But I think there's definitely along with the assistance, the encouragement to come to church and to get involved in it, because, if we're giving you these things, it's, we're doing it to help you, and in return, why don't you come and see what God really wants from you, and so my wife's sister gets resources from the Mormon Church. She's a nominal Mormon. She smokes, but she does profess belief in it, and so she gets assistance with her bills and with food. So that'd be an interesting thing to know. It's something that I haven't really researched to know if they help with the population in general. But I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't.
Hi. I was so excited to come hear this because I was raised Mormon, and I was highly bullied in the church as a child. So I left as soon as my parents told me I could stop going to sacrament meeting, basically. But then my parents died both pretty much in quick succession. And I was still, like you said, I hadn't gone through like the formal paperwork or whatever to leave the church. And in fact, I moved here, didn't tell the church where I was going because I didn't want them to know. And I suspect that one of my horde of family in Utah let it slip because they finally contacted me, and I was kind of like in this sort of, because both my parents had died, and when you're raised Mormon, there's that kind of families are together forever.
They had been married in the temple?
Yes. Yeah. And my mom was very active. My dad was like, I guess I'll do what your mom wants to do. So they were both buried, it's funny, okay, this is an aside, but it's funny that you're talking about the Masonic rites because they were both buried in the
temple.
Full,
with the green
funny hat with the little apron.
It looks like a baker's hat, yeah.
And as I was clearing out all the stuff from my parents' house, I found my grandfather's Masonic stuff, and I was like, this looks very familiar to me. It's funny. But that being said, it was kind of, and I told the bishop who contacted me, I was like, no, I'm not interested. Don't send visiting teachers. I don't want to see anyone. Please take me off the records. I don't even want to be a member. And he was like, okay, and he was like, if you do this, then you would have to be baptized again, and you would no longer be sealed to your parents. And I was like, and that kind of was like, you're kind of like, as a raised Mormon, that is like aggressive thing to say to me.
Fear and intimidation.
And I was so angry, and I'm still so angry that I'm like, I don't even want to bother with all this stupid paperwork. I don't want to write a stupid letter. I don't want to, but secretly I'm kind of like, scared of not seeing my parents ever again. And I anyway, that's kind of a ramble, but I just wanted to
I
hear your
appreciate that.
perspective.
Yeah, it was like I was saying in addressing that first question. I mean, we're all on our own paths, and the effects of these things that we're taught and indoctrinated as a child have incredible impacts on us. And yeah, there's just something in the back of your mind saying, what if they are right after all? They could be. Yeah. But one way in a way, I think it's kind of nice that you leave your name on the record of the church. Then they can overinflate the numbers all they want, but you know you're not really part of it. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm not sure if you still follow this, but I was reading about a month ago that the Mormons were going through a bit of a rebranding. They want to be called the Church now, and they're trying to stop using the word Mormon, and I was just wondering why this is.
I've heard the same thing. I think it's because Thomas Monson, who was the president of the church, died in the last year, and now the new president is Russell M. Nelson, and so he's trying to, I guess, assert his feelings and influence on it. They don't like being called Mormons. I don't know why. They don't even want to be called LDS. But the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is so long, and I mean, what is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And along with that, I mentioned this home teaching program that they've had. They've had that for decades, if not more than a century. They've done away with that, I think, because people probably just weren't doing it, and so now it's more on an as-needed basis. As people feel like they need help or a visit or some kind of special message, then they'll do that. So, but anyway, I think that's why, is because they have a new prophet. I haven't heard anything more earth-shattering than what you said. We keep waiting for Jesus to come again, but that still hasn't happened.
Hi. This might be a bit of a personal question, but you were mentioning that the Mormon Church is pretty serious about their gender roles. And I was wondering, so when you and your wife were first married, did that structure inform how you related to each other? And is that something you had to specifically negotiate as you moved away from the church, or is that something that evolved naturally between you two?
I would say just more evolved naturally. It wasn't something that I think was harped on too much, although you did hear over and over that the woman's place is in the home and to raise children, and so that's kind of what we did. And like I say, that's one of the regrets that we had. I mean, if we had to do it all over again, I mean, I was able, as difficult as it was, I was able to go to school, get a degree, and find good employment. She didn't get to do that because she was supporting me, and that's something that we really regret. We could have postponed having kids for a while and done that, but she's quite outspoken and very knows what she wants. But she was also very very believing and wanting to do what was right. Just to give a little bit of background on her, she came from a broken family, and her parents divorced. Her mom had mental illness issues and was hospitalized for a long time, and for a year or two, her mom took the 6 kids and went and lived in Texas with another man who wasn't her dad, and Carolee's dad didn't know where they were that whole time. Things got really tight financially, and Carolee's mom put her and 2 kids, Carolee and her brother, in an orphanage where they could have been adopted. And she really loved it there. She got to go down the table and pick out her own cereal, and she got to pick her own crayons to, to color her picture. So this was really, really nice to her compared to how it had been. But after 6 months, someone came in and wanted to adopt them. And so they had to know, they finally found out who their father was, and he came and got them. But eventually, Carolee's mom started doing better. She remarried, and Carolee went back to live with her mom in Bountiful, Utah, and she met a wonderful family there who kind of took her under their wings. And they were just really nice and gave her the kind of family support that she had never had. So that was her experience with Mormonism. These are really nice people. I can't count on my family, but these Mormons are great. But yeah, she has strong feelings about what she wants to do. She's worked outside of the home for a long time. She was a newspaper area manager for the Salt Lake Tribune for a while, where she supervised 100 or so carriers. I guess that doesn't happen anymore. I guess everything is online nowadays. But
I was going to ask kind of a similar question about the treatment of females in the church, especially like with divorce, and you talked about people going where your families are together. That what happens with in divorce, as far as being with your families, like your kids or whatever.
Boy, I don't know the answer to that. I know that the temple divorces are granted. I mean, you can't just go into you can go and get your civil marriage dissolved, through divorce, but the temple marriage requires some sort of special declaration. Oh, maybe you know the answer, maybe? Oh.
My friend went through it. She was talking, she would go to the bishop and tell him what her husband was doing, which was abusing the children and et cetera, whatever. And the bishop was sort of like, became a kind of a confidant there or whatever, but he was finally the one that was like, you have to leave this guy. And so I think it's kind of it's very, very difficult, but when they see that there's abuse going on, or if, you know what I mean, like, I think if you're just like, oh, we just don't love each other anymore, then the bishop's going to be like, well, come on in, let's have some counseling and let's talk about, whatever. But, in extreme circumstances, she was the one that was supported. So I think there's, it's hard to say. And I think it is unfair in a lot of ways. If it is a case where the relationship isn't working, they don't believe in that because you're, whatever. But if it's an extreme circumstance where, abuse or like financial, you're becoming destitute because someone has a gambling problem or something and the children are suffering, then, the leaders of the church are not without a heart, and they will counsel you to go that direction, but it is difficult. That's what I know.
Let's talk about religion in the workplace. I know that the Mormon Church was in control of a large insurance company, Beneficial Life, in Salt Lake City. You could not become an officer of that company unless you were a member of the Mormon Church. A bunch of Mormons took over, some Mormon-funded group took over Ben Franklin Savings and Loan here in Portland. You couldn't get anywhere in that company unless you were Mormon. They ran it into the ground. I know that they controlled 23andMe. I guess I've heard that they control the University of Phoenix. I also hear that they have great influence within the FBI, that many FBI agents are Mormons. Can you explain about how this Mormon influence operates in any workplaces in America? And, for example, if somebody wants to leave the church and they're employed in a place where the Mormon church has great influence, that might be a real problem for them. And for the rest of us who are not in the Mormon church, should we be worried about any of these institutions being under the influence of the Mormon church?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with that, but yeah, I mean, you're right. I know that the Mormon church has huge, multi-billion-dollar holdings in a number of companies. I imagine that the income, from the holdings in these companies is greater than the income that they receive from, their tithe-paying members, which, if everyone's paying 10% of their income, that's a lot of money that they're receiving. Yeah, I don't doubt what you're saying. I worked I went to work for Utah Power and Light in 1985 in Salt Lake City, and at that time there was at least one member of the LDS higher up leadership. In fact, I think it was Gordon B. Hinckley, who later became prophet, who was on the board of Utah Power and Light. So I'm not sure what kind of influence that he had, but I'm sure it was some. When Pacificorp up here merged with Utah Power, I think that was maybe one of the conditions that they got rid of any Mormons that were on, or at least Mormons in leadership that were on our board. I can say that everyone that I worked with at Utah Power was Mormon, and at the time that I hired on there, I was going through this process of having my doubts and leaving. But the boss who hired me was under the impression, it came up in the interview, that I had served a mission and all of that, and I was, sort of happy to provide that information because I wanted the job, and it's easy to, yeah. I'm acknowledging my deceit in getting a job here. Yeah. But I eventually told him, I says, I have left it, and here's why, here's all these reasons why. And he says, boy, I really feel sorry for you, and I think you should reconsider it. I think, really? This should have nothing to do with work, and yeah, but everyone else that I worked with was Mormon.
Yeah, I've been reflecting on like the people who choose to break away or challenge something. What would cause an individual to dispute, challenge, leave, whatever, hundreds of thousands of believers in something. And, you start getting this little pumped up sense of importance and self-worth that you're the only person who sees the truth. And then I start thinking about the birthers and like the deniers of climate change and other things. And it's just like, are we just on one end of the continuum of craziness?
Probably so.
Over here? Over here. All right. Thank you for your presentation. We really enjoyed it. I do have a question because I was kind of expecting you to comment a little more about how you were treated by your former organization, because we have heard from speakers here in the past, and based on personal experience of listening to ex-Mormons, and how in several cases they were really treated horribly and were pursued and tried to be brought into the fold. And so far, you're either very kind or you're just not, you haven't had any bad experience like that. So if you can comment on that, thank you.
Yeah, well, it's been 30 years, and I've been able to let a lot of it go, which I'm really glad I could. I think what we found the most was that we were no longer trusted. It's like, my wife was in the primary presidency, which is leadership over, the little kids in the church. And, there's a lot of trust placed in people with that. And when we decided to leave, it was like, people didn't want us to be around their kids anymore. And in a lot of ways, it's very subtle. And part of it was we weren't going to church anymore, and so we weren't associating with them anymore, and so we're just kind of forgotten. And it's and the other thing is people don't want to be around you because they look at people who have been very involved in the church as and then leaving as being deceived by Satan, and so we can't associate with them, or that's going to affect us, and we don't want to be deceived by the devil too. So it was very sad. And in the beginning, we would get invited to a get-together or something, and it would turn out it would be a presentation where it was about the church, and I remember one in particular. It was the parable of the prodigal son, and so it became very obvious who the prodigal son was. Yeah, and boy, that wasn't very subtle, but yeah, that was their whole purpose. It wasn't to still be our friends. It was to come back. It's just not the same without you here. Hey, sorry, we have to be honest with our feelings and what we know.
Hi, thanks for the coming today. I have a question on the secrecy of the Mormon Church. It seems like there's a lot of secrets that they try to keep from the people that attend the church, and the longer you're in the church, the more of these secrets you find out. Is there some kind of training that you get at each level that teaches you more and more about the different secrets that they keep until at the very top, then most of the things? Like I believe that they believe in the 3 degrees of heaven, and most of the people in the church do not know that.
I think most of the people in the church know that. Even though it's not really official doctrine, the 3 degrees of heaven, we all learned about that at a very early age. And it's very much a part of the temple ritual itself. But I think there are other things that you're talking about that I certainly don't have any knowledge of, that I wouldn't be surprised that, the higher you get, the more secrecy there is involved. I know there's an ordinance called having your calling and election made sure, and that's some sort of official temple rite that once that happens, it's assured that you're going to be in the celestial kingdom or the highest there. And I've been told that Mitt Romney has received that. Or maybe it was revoked because he didn't become president. I don't know. Yeah, I have no doubt about that. The temple ceremony itself is secret. Although I think if you go out online, there are videos of it, and there's the actual transcript of what the temple ceremony is. Because people have gone in and secretly recorded it. Do you know anything about that? There are secret handshakes that you learn there, and certain signs that you make. You get a secret name in the temple, and the person that you're marrying gets a secret name. And this is what's funny, going back to gender roles here. I got to know her name, but she didn't get to know mine. Because when we get to the other side, I would be there, and I would be calling her to come through the veil. She was really pissed off about that.
Provided that you'd be there first, right? Because otherwise.
That's just the way it works. Yeah, sorry, ladies, that's just the way it works.
Are there deliberate
Oh.
political aspirations? Are there deliberate political aspirations in the Mormon Church beyond Utah? For instance, having any sort of control or influence on, say, national politics?
Well, there's this sort of prophecy that at some time the Constitution of the United States would hang by a thread, and that the elders from Israel or the Mormon Church would come in and save it. And I think they're still waiting for that, and a lot of people may have seen Mitt Romney as that savior to come in and saving the Constitution hanging by a thread. Instead, we got Trump. Yeah, or Romney might have been a lot better.
How do the Mormons usually vote? Republican, Democrat?
Republican. Yeah, they're really conservative.
So that's, I mean, with somebody like Donald Trump there, can they justify that kind of a vote?
A lot did. I think they had a really hard time with it, and you didn't see this same kind of support for Trump that you would have seen for another, more mainstream Republican candidate. My sister and brother-in-law, who are pretty active Mormons, they wrote in somebody else. They couldn't vote for Trump, just on his moral, standings alone. But they would never vote for Hillary Clinton.
I got to tour the big church built whenever it was built in 1990 or 91 or
The church office building?
in Wilsonville or Tualatin.
The temple, yeah.
Yeah, so that was really bizarre, to say the least. And in the basement, there was this huge bowl. And it's always with this amazing fountain, and they said that the marriages took place there and other secret ceremonies. And then they weren't really willing to say anything more or show me any more rooms, because I was like, what's in that room? What's in that room? And they were like doing this. They were like robots smiling, doing this.
Yeah.
And so I want the pagan imagery of the bull, and it's very Greek too. I want to know if there's a connection to these old religions that idolized animals such as the bull or the goat or other, is there any, and how do they explain the similarities?
I know what you're talking about, and I don't really know the symbolism or the reason for the oxen or the bulls that is supported on. But what was done there was called baptisms for the dead. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but in Mormon theology, everybody living or who has lived needs to be baptized physically to enter heaven or God's kingdom. And so Mormons go into the temple and they're called proxy baptisms. And that's why so much interest in genealogy in Mormonism is they go and research, find all these names. These names get submitted to the temple, and then you go in, and I did it, a few times when, as a youth and a teenager, and you go in, and they read off the name, and then they do the few words, and then they dunk you in the water, and you come out, and then the next person comes in, and the next name is done, and you go around and around like that, and you might do 15 names or something, and everyone else in your group of 10 may do 15 names, and so 150 people that had died without being baptized in this life gets to be baptized. Now that doesn't mean that they're automatically saved. That means they have the opportunity to accept, the gospel in the afterlife. Yeah, so there's all this missionary work going on in the afterlife too. I don't think we even paid attention to it. I didn't. Yeah, I didn't. Yeah. See, yeah, you're paying more attention than I was.
Carl, that was really interesting and informative, and I just want to honor your respect for the people that helped your family and helped your wife's family and their good intentions. There was no vehement, this is a horrible group or evil. They're misinformed, and I just want to really honor that kindness and the goodness that you expressed in the people and their good heart. It was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.